And then we need to talk about the development of flexibility, because we know building muscle and maintaining flexibility are very opposite things, but they do complement each other and they do need to be done in tandem with each other, right? So being a dancer, I love to talk about flexibility. In a definition form, flexibility is just the ability to move joints through a full range of motion, okay? So range of motion could be affected by several things, okay? We have bone structure, just generally how your joints are put together. You could have packed joints where there's a lot of stuff happening, which could be good for functional reasons, right? If you don't want a joint to move a whole lot, it should be packed tight, right, with a lot of different structures. But we can also have loose joints for more mobility, which could again be functional for other reasons. We also have soft tissues that are going to kind of encapsulate various joints that are going to resist movement in certain directions. So this could be our muscles. So that's why it's directly related to strength, right? Because usually we say that people who build more muscle and who increase the size of their muscle have more strength, but they decrease in their flexibility because those muscles are going to be pulling and creating more resistance at the joint level. Okay, but this could also be other types of connective tissue like tendons, ligaments, just the joint capsule itself, fascia. So any of you who are into foam rolling and myofascial release or percussion therapy, fascia can have a huge effect on your range of motion. And as a dancer, we used to do a lot of myofascial release. And it was impressive how much extra range of motion you could get after like a percussion therapy for 30 seconds even. You don't even have to do it for very long. It's crazy. And then your skin also can provide some resistance to movement. So in terms of the integrity of these different types of soft tissues, habitual disuse and lack of exercise are usually associated with a loss of elasticity. So again, it's kind of similar to like if you don't use the body structure, it's not going to be functional the way that you want it to. So daily activities requiring, or at least in terms of what we typically do, right? Our daily activities rarely use a full range of motion and therefore usually aren't sufficient to maintain elasticity in soft tissues, which is why flexibility, if you look at the ACSM handbook, right, flexibility is recommended, I think, like 2 or 3 days out of the week for 10 or 15 minutes. It's not very long, right? But just doing stretches that kind of incorporate different body parts a few times out of the week really does a lot for your range of motion to kind of maintain the mobility of those soft tissues that kind of surround your joints. Benefits we can see at any age in the lifespan, so flexibility doesn't necessarily improve at any faster rate or slower rate throughout the lifespan. Limits in flexibility, however, can contribute to increased risk of injury, right? So if you don't have the range of motion to accommodate some type of compensatory mechanism that might need to happen as a result of a postural perturbation, right? If you don't have that range of motion available to you, injury is kind of inevitable. But limited flexibility can also restrict your mobility. Flexibility is important. That's kind of the main key here. But there are other characteristics or factors that could impact flexibility. So one of those things is specificity to joints, right? We're flexible at some joints, but not at others, and it's dependent, again, on which joints have a higher demand for flexibility based on the activities that we engage in on a regular basis. There could also be genetic factors that could play a role. So there's an example of a connective tissue disorder called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which I don't remember if it's a lack of collagen in their connective tissue, but there's different forms of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome or EDS, and it predisposes individuals to have a stretchier and looser soft tissues and joints. So they don't have, like, even if they built up their muscular strength, they don't have the integrity at their joints to support. So they're hypermobile, and that's I can't remember which chromosome it's on, but it's a very, very problematic thing. So too loose is not good. So flexibility is great to a certain extent, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But yeah, so activity demands we kind of already talked about. But lots of factors contributing to flexibility, and lots of reasons why flexibility might be important to maintain throughout the entire lifespan. Speaking of lifespan, let's start in our youth populations. So where men usually have greater strength than women, females usually have greater flexibility than men. And we can think about this almost directly in terms of muscle tissue, right? Because we said that muscles could be creating resistance to movement at certain joints, and if men have more muscle tissue, they have more resistance, therefore less flexibility, right? Versus women, greater. Flexibility tends to usually decline in early adolescence around the 10 to 14 year mark. Boys typically decline sooner than girls do. But this could be to a variety of factors that particularly pertain to maturational changes. So an increase in muscle mass is going to, like we already kind of talked about that relationship there, but more muscle mass kind of leads to a decrease in flexibility. Resistance to obstruction of movement from increased adipose tissue could also be a thing. That decreases flexibility, so the more adipose tissue you have, kind of the more limits you potentially have in your range of motion if that fat tissue gets in the way as you kind of close the space between one segment and another segment. For females in particular, hormonal changes are going to contribute to increased joint laxity after puberty, which could actually help increase their flexibility. But also, I think another thing that the book doesn't point out is that declines in flexibility could also be due to differing rate of bone and muscle growth. Because if you think about adolescence, again in that 10 to 14 age group, usually you go through your largest growth spurt between ages like 12 and 15, I think was the span that we talked about for boys and girls, right? But you think that growth, if you have a growth spurt, your muscles are, as a result of your bones changing length, your muscles are attached to your bone, right? So through like tendons, okay? So if you are growing or your bones are growing, that's automatically going to start stretching your muscles, right? And you kind of have to play this catch up in flexibility, which is kind of where growing pains come from, is because your muscles are getting stretched, kind of past a part where they can physiologically react if they needed to. So structural changes in limb length can also kind of affect flexibility. And then the last thing I wanted to mention was sociocultural norms again, is that women generally participate in more activities that promote flexibility, such as gymnastics and dancing and yoga, similar to how males usually engage in more strength-related activities. So the types of daily activities that we engage in and the types of physical activity or exercise that we engage in, just based on gender roles, can still have a large effect on flexibility, even from the youth age. Okay. In terms of empirical support or looking at the research on flexibility training in youth, typically training will significantly improve or help maintain range of motion. Cessation of training, or if you stop training, usually leads to reversibility. So it's the same thing like in strength, right? Typically anyone is going to be able to improve or maintain strength if they do training, but there's that reversibility effect. If they stop strength training, you get the atrophy concept, right? In this case, your joint structures or those soft tissues are just going to stiffen and lose their elasticity. Also, research has looked at how the lack of training will likely lead to a typical decline in range of motion. Again, if you don't experience a full range of motion X number of days out of the week, right, you're going to have that decline. Different types of stretching might be more effective on certain body parts, and stretching should be focused on areas where improved flexibility is desired. So, for those of us who sit a lot, or if we have desk jobs, or we're in class all the time, typically we're going to have shortened hip flexors, right? Some of you might say like, oh, my hip flexors are super tight. But we also might have very tight low back, depending on how you sit, I guess, too. But you also might have really tight low back extensors. So again, the way that we engage in our daily activities is going to highly affect where we might need the flexibility training more. But different types of stretching, I don't know if you guys have heard of like ballistic stretching, which is if we do stretching with a bounce, but I don't think that is really good, or it used to be like a hot thing in dance, I know, and then research came out and they were like, no, wait, don't do that. So I know ballistic stretching is a thing, dynamic stretching is a thing, so if you guys have ever heard of PNF stretching, that's proprioceptive, oh, now I'm blanking, proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. So that was a very common stretching technique that we would use in my dance classes, where you have a brief period of active muscle contraction followed by a brief period of passive stretch. Okay, and that actually helps kind of rework your neural networks to adjust your stretch thresholds, at which you would typically have a stretch reflex response. So, I don't know, different types of stretching. If we move from youth and kind of look into adulthood, we get further decreases in flexibility during adulthood, so that's why people are like, my body hates me, right? But it is specific to certain body parts, so there's usually a greater loss in flexibility in the upper body versus the lower body. And that makes sense, right? If you think about daily activities, typically people walk, and they are experiencing a relatively consistent range of motion when they're walking every day, but their upper body doesn't necessarily have to be that active when they're walking, right? Or when you're doing other daily activities. So it kind of makes sense that we would have more loss of flexibility in our upper body than our lower body. But in terms of sex differences, there's not really a huge discrepancy between the two in terms of flexibility. So in terms of like how much they lose. But contributing factors to increased joint stiffness could include degeneration of musculoskeletal soft tissue. So if you think about osteoarthritis, osteoporosis, right? Osteoarthritis is where we lose the articular cartilage between joints. So generally there's more resistance to movement if you have a bone-on-bone interaction than if you've got that lubricated cartilage to help kind of smooth out joint movements. We also have increased collagen and decreased elastin in connective tissues. So if you guys remember your connective tissue anatomy, collagen is important for tensile strength and kind of the structural integrity of your connective tissue. And elastin is important for the elastic properties, which we noted already decline if you don't participate in flexibility training, right? Or in just engagement in regular flexibility activities. Okay. In terms of disuse, it's kind of uncertain how disuse affects the rate of decline, but we know that disuse of certain joints or kind of not experiencing full ranges of motion are going to contribute to increased joint stiffness as well. So that leads us to flexibility training in adulthood. Okay, both specialized stretch training and general exercise are going to help improve or maintain flexibility. Obviously, if you have more specialized stretch or flexibility training, you're going to have probably greater effects on your maintenance or improvement of flexibility. But again, just general exercise and getting around and doing stuff with your body, right? Experiencing fuller ranges of motion through walking, or if you're cleaning your house, right? It doesn't even have to be anything major, but just staying active can really help in maintaining your flexibility as well. Again, you have to use joints for your joints to love your body, right? But interventions have been looked at throughout research, including stretching programs, Pilates training, resistance training, low impact aerobics, so even doing, like swimming or water aerobics. Tai Chi is another one that's also good for cognitive maintenance as well, kind of that mind-body connection. Rhythmic stretching, general physical activity, right? Any of these things have been shown to help either improve or maintain flexibility. So moving is kind of the key component to maintaining flexibility. Same thing with strength, right? Movement is key. You don't even have to do super high intensity. So I have 2 summary slides that kind of put together the main points on both strength and flexibility. So again, absolute strength is usually greater in males than females. There's a more marked difference during adolescence and beyond, just because of the gonadal hormone changes that we see as a result of the maturational processes in the lifespan. We have increases in strength during childhood and adolescence, kind of stabilized strength throughout like our young adulthood ages, and then we have a gradual decline beginning around age 50 with a more rapid decline in older adulthood. Again, these age changes or age-related changes can be affected by incorporating training, right? And we will see strength gains or benefits at any age across the lifespan. Changes in strength tend to parallel changes in muscle mass. However, other individual and environmental factors can contribute to those observed changes. So we mentioned a big one is neurological changes, but the other one is how our muscle size, right, individual muscle size is changing, and how that is different in terms of how muscle mass changes. When we look at flexibility, our summarizing comments are that an individual's range of motion at a given joint more likely reflects the level of activity and training than age does. Okay, so again, we can benefit from training at any point in the lifespan. On average, on average, we see a decline in flexibility beginning around adolescence, kind of primarily due to that large growth spurt that is experienced there, and then that decline is kind of persistent based on different physical changes, as well as how we engage in daily activities and what types of activities we're doing to stress joint range of motion. And consistent flexibility training has positive effects on range of motion at any age throughout the lifespan. Again, cessation of training can reverse range of motion gains, so same thing as strength, right? The big takeaway is just stay active. Any type of physical activity is better than no physical activity. So that wraps up our Chapter 11 discussion, and you have Chapter 12 to watch next.